tonight, nearly 50 cases reported of women watched and recorded in Walmart bathrooms across the country. Tonight, the retailer is facing a massive lawsuit from allegations that actually stem from right here in Metro Atlanta.
Atlanta News First anchor and attorney Joy Limnacron is live at 5 following these breaking developments. Joy, what can you tell us?
Well, Ellen and Tori, this lawsuit actually originated right here in Georgia after a janitor at a DeKalb County Walmart was arrested for videoing women in bathrooms. Well, it is now expanded to include incidents all around the nation. Lester Jolly was arrested in June of 2023 for recording women in bathrooms at the Walmart on Memorial Drive in Decatur. 5 women, including current and former Walmart employees and a customer, filed the initial lawsuit in DeKalb County State Court. One of the victims was an employee who said that she was fired and told by management not to tell other employees about the incident. Well, now the lawsuit has been amended to allege a nationwide systemic practice of reckless behavior and the intentional concealment of crimes by Walmart, all related to sex crimes in store bathrooms.
What appears to be the case as well is discovering that there are more victims involved and finding out the sheer depth of the number of people potentially implicated will likely require an amendment to the complaint, not just to potentially cover people who may come forward, but also to indicate a lack of action by Walmart.
Now, plaintiffs anticipate finding over 100 victims with dozens of incidents of sexual violations in Walmart bathrooms. Lester Jolly is currently out on bond. Alan?
All right, Joy, thank you. Well, Georgia